Peter, thanks for joining us today. I'm so glad to have you on another one.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's fun. You and I, we're going to talk about some parallels. You and I have some
Yeah.
parallel pathing. We came from similar places and have gone through some similar steps, but obviously some differences as well. You know the show, right? We always try and look at the individual stories of applied behavioral scientists. We as a discipline tend to look at groups of people and what's common between people. This is a place to celebrate those unique differences, with an emphasis on the fact that there's no one right way into this field. So I want to go all the way back, Peter. We got to like start with like early Peter. Uh, like talk about like 7-year-old Peter. What is he into? What do you think he was gonna do like in the world?
Yeah, I think there were many evolutions of what much younger Peter wanted to do. And I think around the age of 7, I probably had gotten over the realization that I probably wasn't going to be a truck driver, even though I really wanted that at about maybe 5 years old. Um, and I think around then, like I grew up near a hospital, and so a lot of my friends' parents were like doctors and like nurses and stuff like that. And I do remember sometime around then, I was in the car with my dad, and like he would like asking any child like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And had said like, I guess I'm going to be a doctor, almost just like as this like painful like assumption that that's what people did when they grow up. And obviously that's so kind of a weird assumption. That's a very hard job both to get into, but also like to also do like the very challenging job. Um, and my dad rightfully like pressured me like, what, so why,
Why that?
why that? And I didn't really have a good answer. And so I thankfully moved past that just like fatalistic assumption. And I think in a few years it was very briefly things like an actor, but then it wasn't until like later in high school that I even become aware that there is this thing like psychology even out there that appealed for a variety of reasons.
So let's not skip to high school. So you
Yeah.
have this sort of like, hey, I'm surrounded by doctors. That might be a thing.
Mm.
What kind of classes in school, was there a favorite topic that sort of you were leaning towards in those early like middle school kind of years as you start to get a little bit of differentiation and start to choose for yourself? Did you gravitate a particular way?
Yeah, I think very later on, absolutely, I did gravitate. I think at that point, I was one of those kids who just kind of liked school. Um, like I really liked English. I really liked things that allowed you to have some degree of creativity while still like enabling you to solve a puzzle in some way. So like some kinds of math were ended up being like really interesting. Not surprisingly, like social studies and social sciences type topics really resonated with me.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is my all-time favorite personality scale is the need for cognition scale.
Yeah.
And I think it is, in fact, one of the sort of hallmarks of applied behavioral scientists is they just, we like thinking, we like
Yeah.
puzzling things out and sort of trying to discover. And it's not maybe totally surprising, but so then you get into high school. Did you get exposed to psychology in high school? Did you have like AP Psych or something? Like, was that like a part of your evolve? What was sort of your high school experience like?
Yeah, so we didn't have AP psychology. There was, I remember, just one event where you got to hear about different like topics that we didn't get a chance to learn about in school, and one of them was psychology. Um, and that did strike me as like, oh, this is cool. I get to like understand. Someone has figured out how we think. All these things that like I naturally wonder about. There's like these really cool actually answers to that. And then simultaneously, I did have my aunt and uncle were both they were kind of psychologists. They were primatologists, and they were both people who I like really respected. They were charismatic. They had this cool life where they went off to Botswana and studied baboons, every summer. And so maybe I had a particularly distorted view of what a psychologist's life was like. Um, but I had both these like really positive role models in my life, and then I had a very early taste of this topic that I ended up finding really cool.
Yeah, so that is a great comparison in that you sort of get this idea of like, yes, I will become a traveling, I will go and study which some people do, right?
Yeah,
Cross-cultural
it's a
psych.
real job,
That is a real job, although potentially not,
a
actually
rare job, but
a rarer job, but applied behavioral scientists do get to do projects outside of the US and you look at ideas for
right.
other places. I mean, You can go to Botswana and probably not working with baboons, but you might be working on,
Sure.
washing hands and other kinds of
Hmm.
public health behaviors and those sorts of things that we do care about in lots of different places. Um, Also, having an aunt and uncle as a primatologist just sounds cool.
Yeah.
Like, it sounds like an
No, they're
amazing
fantastic.
childhood piece. So then you start, you get into high school, you're starting to think about college. Did you have a really clear idea of like where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do, or sort of how did college materialize for you?
I think so. I was one of the people who ended up going to a liberal arts school, and that was there was some degrees of self-selection that played into that. Partly, I think the types of students who went there, I felt like I resonated with. And partly it was an exciting opportunity to get to learn like a bunch of stuff. I didn't know at that point that like, oh, yes, I wanted to become a psychologist, or maybe I wanted to become a, you know, public health specialist or what have you. And so I saw that as a nice opportunity to get exposed to a lot of things and eventually kind of figure that out, even though I did have this early taste of psychology being a pretty interesting topic.
And was
And so,
that
yeah,
was that liberal? I mean, this is where we start to parallel, right? Like,
yeah,
so I went to Swarthmore, you went to
Haverford.
Haverford, another one of the tri colleges. So for folks that don't
Hmm.
know, Bryn Mawr, Haverford, and Swarthmore are part of a network where you can take classes across them, and they're all quite close geographically. Um, was like the liberal arts piece a really deliberate choice? Like, hey, I want someplace that I can sort of do a sampling of things.
I think yes. So I think there were three factors that played into it. Number one was that actually that was the more intentional piece. Two was I wanted to go someplace warm, and I grew up in Vermont, and Pennsylvania in my head was someplace warm. So that shows you the point of reference that I had growing up. And three, it just kind of felt right. Like this is a place where people seemed happy, and it sounded like a place where I could be happy too.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, I don't know about the clearly you don't can't call the weather. But I could see where it's a transitional state, from Vermont if you're used to
Right.
the green and the whatever, it is has a particular aesthetic. So I can understand this. So then you sort of show up at Haverford, was what's in the box, what was on the label? Did you find yourself sort of starting to, you know, try different departments and look around for different things, or did you specialize fairly quickly?
So in the very beginning, yes, I tried all the stuff. I followed that typical path, but very quickly I realized actually this thing that I got an early taste of is really interesting. And I do think that kind of any topic can be genuinely interesting, like whether it be, how to build very complicated machines or physics or what have you. But something about psychology was really appealing because it's everything you learn, you can immediately kind of reflect back to your own life. And I do think that's probably part of a reason why it's a relatively popular major, even though it doesn't always translate into, say, like the most direct applications for jobs or the immediate like most lucrative careers. It's very easy to understand how these ideas are relevant, and I found that kind of very appealing personally, to me. That, and I also like was going into economics too a little bit as well, and behavioral economics tied into that very nicely.
And I mean, was there ever a temptation towards more like clinical psych or sort of the more individualistic version of psych? I mean, you talk about, the way that psych can be evocative of things in our own lives. It's
Yeah.
very easy to connect with in a way that, sometimes some topics aren't necessarily. Uh, was there a part of you that was like, maybe this is going to go a clinical direction, or did you kind of know like, hey, the sort of like more soc part of this is going to be interesting to me?
I did think about clinical psychology. I think my theory at the time was, and this could be totally be wrong, is that if you go into clinical psychology, you're very often dealing with challenges that are by their very nature incredibly hard to solve, whether it's like, entrenched depression or personality disorders, things like that. And I worried that by dealing with those issues and continuously being exposed to them, regardless of whether I'd be good at helping people overcome those challenges, I would worry what the effect would be kind of on myself as a practitioner. And so that was my thinking as to why I still get to, there is a way for me to deal with these ideas without having to kind of be exposed to the harsh realities of how people
Sort of a
have to
heart
live
of
with them.
darkness problem here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I could totally understand that. And so did you kind of always have, because you had well-educated primatologists, sort of people in your life, doctors, et cetera. Did you have in your mind, hey, like I do undergrad and then I do grad, and then was there like a progression in your mind, or you just sort of went to college and were like, let's see what happens?
A little bit that. It was started with the latter and it became the former. My first like summer jobs in the beginning of college is I worked at like a children's science museum where I helped kids, I was Mr. Peter the Explainer, where I helped kids learn about new ideas. Partly because I hadn't decided what I wanted to do at that point, and it seemed kind of cool. But the more got exposed to psychology, said, okay, well, I know this is a career. Why don't I try doing some research? And so my first job was, I did, halfway through college, get kind of a taste of it by doing some research with someone named Angela Duckworth at University of Pennsylvania, which is down the road, and then ended up really liking it. So that combined with I think those role models that I had were good people, were seemed fun and seemed like they had a really interesting life. And as I got to get a taste of research, I was like, oh, this is something that could be actually a pretty cool job. It's incredibly intrinsic by its very nature. You get to like focus your time on these ideas, which I find to be very interesting. Isn't that cool? The fact that that can be a job.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as a researcher, Angela's on the more applied end of things. She certainly is not a, pure cognition sort of, she has some idea that there are things that they're, that might be done in the world because of
Mhm.
what she does. Did you think at the time, hey, I might go into a more academic career like Angela, and I'm going to be a professor and I'm going to research things? Or did you know at that time, hey, maybe academia is not the right sort of long-term path for me?
I think that I did come to that decision, which I think, spoiler alert.
No
But that
spoiling, no spoiling. Swiper, no swiping,
who
man.
knows? Uh, but I had not come to that conclusion at that point. I thought in fact, I was pretty gung ho about research. I was like, well, if I want to do this, I got this taste and was like, I like this. This is interesting. This will be a cool career. I need to dive headfirst into it. And so I then like tried to do as many research opportunities while on campus. I like did all the statistics classes to get prepared for that. Then I sought out job opportunities right after college to kind of prepare my resume for um, eventual PhD applications. And so at the time, I was pretty gung ho about this idea of kind of going into academia.
Got it. And so then, you get toward the end of college, you're starting to look at grad programs and things. Um, Tell me a little bit about that search and what was guiding where you think about going and how you think about what comes next.
Yeah, so I think the what ended up being a more pivotal moment is not necessarily the PhD program that I eventually started, but the research that I sought out right afterwards. And so I ended up kind of reaching out to people who were just in the Philadelphia area, and there were these two professors at Penn who kind of ended up basically. I cold emailed them, and they were kind enough to offer me a job. One was this new professor named Adam Grant, and he was doing this um, kind of workplace stuff, who I had heard about through Angela. And there was this other person named Christina Bicchieri who was doing relatively different stuff like social norms, collective behaviors, and kind of this combination of philosophy, behavioral economics, and psychology. Um, Christina was able to kind of offer a paid position, so that ended up tipping the scales, and that was the direction my career ended up going. But it was with her I got to learn about all these hyper applied ways in which you can take these ideas and actually use them to shape really meaningful behaviors. So she worked on things like, again, collective behaviors, but with groups like UNICEF and international governments, on how you can shape really large scale behaviors in like developing settings or within companies and stuff like that. And so that's where I ended up getting exposed to this fresh side of psychology that I hadn't seen in either a classroom or a laboratory.
Yeah, and you nailed something there in the sort of see it, be it phenomenon. I mean, it's hard to know that there is this applied version of it
Yeah,
unless somebody is sort of showing you there's this applied version of it,
yeah,
which is, and thus full circle why we have podcasts like these, right? Because, I think if you end up at a more, let's call it academically oriented school where it's sort of like, and then you do basic cognitive research.
yeah.
50 years. It's hard to imagine that there is a different way of maybe being an academic, an applied academic in the world.
No, I think that's a good point, and I think the exposure piece is important. Like what back when, what I mentioned earlier, I what was nice about psychology was so immediately relevant and so immediately easy to think about how this applies. But then once you actually go through, actually trying out these other ideas, and you take that second step of seeing how it can be applied, that can be just as interesting. And I think for me, I had just like been so um, satisfied with just like, oh, these ideas are cool. I hadn't taken those more applied steps until I did some work with Christina.
Well, and there's a time aspect to this as well, right? In that,
Sure.
we're talking here about, the mid 2010s, right? Like
Hmm.
2015, et cetera.
That's right.
A full 10 years after I graduated, right? And there was no MBDS. There was a dramatic, Barry Schwartz, my undergraduate advisor, was
Oh
on a
yeah,
much more applied end, but was sort of seen as, I don't know, maverick is the right word, but sort of seen as
different.
unusual
Yeah.
as a social psychology for wanting to do that. And certainly the Philly area has a strong tradition of more applied sort of versions of this stuff, at UPenn and other places. So you went off and you're doing the research, you go off
Hmm.
to a grad program. At what point did you go, hey, maybe this is not it? Which is such a
Yeah,
difficult thing to admit to yourself and to other people, and you're on this path, and
absolutely.
you know.
No, it's a great question. I think for me, so I had, spent these years doing this research and kind of heading down this path. And so I started a PhD program for it and was in it for about a year. And about a year into it, the lab that I was in kind of changed its trajectory of its research. And I found myself asking the question, do I want to go do this other topic that I was a little bit less passionate about? Um, or do I, there is other stuff out there. Do I want to consider other things? And by that point, I think I had done enough actual research, like the work of research, that I realized that the kind of job itself, the ideas were still interesting, but the job itself was a little bit less um, exciting to me. So I actually reached back out to Christina, and then I was like getting her advice, like, hey, this is something I'm kind of battling with. And by that point, kind of serendipitously, she had said, well, I'm actually starting this big project with the Gates Foundation in India. Would you like to work on it with me? And I realized as I was kind of thinking about these two paths again, that actually seems pretty cool. I think I would be happier doing this, still working with these different ideas, but in them, actually feeling like I'm impacting something real and doing a wider variety of stuff rather than just running lab experiments and stuff like that, which can be very fulfilling, but it's a very particular lifestyle that you get into.
Yeah, it's always so interesting that you know in every applied behavioral scientist is a lapsed academic, right? Or an ex-academic somewhere, and we're
Yeah,
always very careful to
that's
be
true.
like, that is a fulfilling and totally reasonable path, even if it is not the path that I chose to. Uh, to your point, academia is reasonable, although it is becoming less and less reasonable over time, right? As the shift of things happen. I think there are larger and larger numbers of people going, wow, maybe this is not something I want to do. But it's interesting to hear, there's an alternative Peter out there in the multiverse, right? Where the lab doesn't change focus. You
Right.
don't end up calling Christina, like she doesn't end up having a project that sort of suck. I'm not one uh tortured by my own past, but like, you know, what if I
Yeah, it's a very
what if
real
I'd
kind of
ended up at
festival.
Colorado instead
Right.
of my advisor moving to Cornell? And what if he'd stayed at Cornell and not gone back to Colorado? And what if a startup hadn't approached me? Right? There is some version of the multiverse out there where Matt stays an academic and Peter stays an academic. Do you think that Peter is happy in that multiverse? Do you think that there's like a pathway down there where you could have been satisfied?
It's certainly possible. I think what would have made it challenging, or I think there's two factors that work against it. One is kind of a probabilistic element, where another factor that I was weighing at the time is that there was an increasing number of people who are getting PhDs and kind of the steady number of jobs that are out there. And I guess I'm not familiar with what the landscape is like today, but I imagine that hasn't changed too much. Um, and I was thinking, do I want to work really, really hard for something that, maybe I won't get a job in the city that I want to live, or maybe I'll have to go to a particular area in order to get something that has a chance of being tenure tracked. And so I think a lot would need to work out for me to have checked these other boxes of just living a good life, like being in a place where I want to be, being ideally in a community that I want to have. And so I think that may have been worse. And I think it would have been a much more unidimensional life. Perfectly, extremely interesting. Like you get to deal with these really deep ideas. But I ended up taking this much more varied path, just by, going away from the standard path. And I've reflecting on it, I feel a lot of fulfillment from having tried all these different experiences.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it is a hard question. Deliberately, I was
Yeah.
provoking, right? It's a hard question because, our brains, as soon as we make a decision, our brains immediately are like, "Hey, and that is obviously the best decision, and I
Yeah.
will interpret all information
Of
to
course.
confirm."
We're kind to ourselves
Peter
that
is
way. Yeah.
great at making decisions, says the brain. So you do make this decision. You do leave your PhD program, which can be very hard to tell people, that you're going to veer off this path. You veer off this path, you go with Christine, you start doing things, about this, the MBDS becomes an option, right? Like, talk to me a little bit about leaving your PhD and sort of how this transitions because you do end up you are more educated than me, right? You go off and get your master's degree. Like, tell me about where this sort of comes in for you.
Yeah. So you bring up MBDBS, and I remember when I was working with Christina before I started my PhD, she was kind of playing around with this idea of starting this master's program. It's like there's not really a core program out there that's doing, training in behavioral sciences. I think maybe there was one other program. Um, and by the time I got back, it's like, oh, this is actually in motion. We're actually really planning for it. And I was working with her, kind of running these projects. So I'll address the kind of academic question first. But I was working with her, and there was a chance to be kind of like one of the incoming, basically the part of the first cohort, and kind of do that. So I did that. Ended up like applying and doing that on the side, doing this master's on the side, while still doing this like behavioral, large scale behavior change work, in developing countries. And so I saw this as an opportunity to kind of close out that educational piece that I had started but not finished a little bit with my PhD, and still get some more of a formal kind of credential with it, while still continuing to do the actual work itself.
And presaging a little bit because you do end up eventually getting an MBA at Booth, right? Another,
Mhm.
there are limited communities in which behavioral science really, has flourished. Philly
Mhm.
is one, Chicago is one. Did you know at the time that, like, hey, I'm going to do this MBDS degree, and then at some point there's an MBA in my future? Like, were you aware of that this early, or does that only come about sort of later?
I I thought that could be an option, but I didn't
Oh,
seriously consider that until later. And I'm happy to talk about kind of what was the kind of thought process behind taking another step out into a new direction.
talk to me about, when you said I thought it might give me a direction.
Mhm.
It sounds like at this point you at least kind of know you might be off this academic because you're still in an academic environment. Yes,
Yeah.
obviously doing applied work, but you're still in a somewhat academic environment. Where did you start to have the notion that, like, hey, maybe starting to get out of this academic environment is going to be where I end up going?
I think it was so I always try to imagine what the next step is in my career. And at the time I was like, oh, well, this we're doing these cool projects, and where do we kind of go from here? Um, and so there were two pieces. And so one, as we were like, we were doing this work with the Gates Foundation, we were starting new projects. Like I had started this work with UNICEF in Mali, we were exploring working in Latin America on a variety of behavior change topics. So the work itself was incredibly interesting, and working on topics that I felt was very meaningful. Eventually started a center with Christina too, and getting that off the ground. But then once I was kind of running the center, which was kind of more formalizing this work into an institution,
Right.
um, I found myself asking like, one, what do I do after this? Do I go into university administration? Do I want to do I want to go to a like behavior change advisory company? what happens to the behavioral industry? I don't know. And so I like the idea of kind of both maintaining that behavioral side while still continuing to get exposed to other stuff. Well, relatively early in my career, at that point, I was in my late 20s. Um, and so I thought that maybe I can still work on intellectually challenging and impactful ideas in something like consulting or something like that. But I don't have a business background. Maybe I need to get an MBA. So that was one piece. The second piece was we were starting to do new projects. Like I was talking to businesses to get them like, hey, maybe we can do like a training program on getting you to understand these ideas and how you can apply them to your own setting. But as I was working with the university administration, there was a kind of a pressure point because their purpose, their like legal status is that they need to supply education and research. And I was drifting in more of like the revenue generating side of things, which, can be fine. It also can be, a threat to your taxable status. And so I didn't want, like, let's play it safe. And I found myself looking at these cool opportunities and not being able to do it while staying within this particular space. Um, and so I thought, okay, well, this is as good a time as any to explore taking another step where I can try out that stuff.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, there is a legacy of these common sense lab, these sort of like on the margins of what we would call an academic center that do really start to look more
Oh, yeah.
like, true consulting groups. And the Pensong group, even the Notion managing director is a very particular sort of version of
Yeah.
what. But you're right, there is this pathway where you kind of do that, and the UPenn system is a great example of, there's in the medical system, like there are all of these sort of like a university hospital is a very interesting example of a sort of nonprofit, sort of,
Yeah. But it's
it's a
still making a lot of money.
yeah, well, still making a lot of money and having a lot of commercial connections, right? Because of insurance
Right.
and things. So there is a pathway down where you go this place. You take a sort of summer consultant, MBA start approach. Do you remember when you really made the decision and what was the flashpoint to like, I am gonna kind of go look at this more like private sector version of this?
Um, I think I had made that decision when I made the decision to go into get an MBA. It's like this is a new world where they are doing some really cool stuff. I think by that point there were like these little startups that were doing cool stuff with behavioral science. There were, companies starting up like Ideas 42 that were doing dedicated work on the topic. It's like it was an interesting space to be in that world. And so I think I was open to the idea of staying more purely within the behavioral science, just happened to be in the private sector. Um, or doing something that maybe there are opportunities to apply these ideas, but working in a company that doesn't just do behavioral science stuff. And I think I was attracted to more traditional consulting as a kind of next step, um, because one, I thought I could kind of learn more there. This would be a newer direction for me, and it would be a way for me to also continue to ask myself the question of like, is what I have been doing the place where I can kind of get the most satisfaction? And that's what I ended up trying out, and so far loving it.
Nothing like an experimental approach to our own
Yeah.
happiness, right? Very behavioral science. What was it, you come to a business school from a fairly unpredictable or unconventional background. Did you find, how did you find going to a business school in terms of
Yeah.
interacting with the people, interacting with curriculum, which can be very different than how we approach things in behavioral science? Like, talk to me a little bit about that experience.
Yeah. So you're right. I was an atypical background. I think these days there are more people who have atypical backgrounds, so I wasn't alone. I maybe was the only person who did my particular path, but other people from, nonprofits, et cetera. Um, and so I was expecting a world where everyone had worked in finance and everyone had worked out of business before that. And I think I was, in a way, surprised to find out that actually no, there's this broad swath of backgrounds. Yeah, there's more people coming from finance than where I was working before, but it's a mix. And I think I was a little bit more attracted to the kind of academic side of it than the average student, just because I had not worked in business before that. I had worked in like, yes, some applied settings, but not this traditional space of like, hey, how do you do accounting and how do you, you know, market a product and things like that. Those were all very new ideas to me. And so I think like it was a very different world, but it was less different kind of than I was expecting it to be. And I got a lot out of it. And I tried to find ways like to kind of bring back the behavioral piece, try to find ways to kind of keep that alive. Like I purposely chose Booth, to your point, like that is a place that does a lot of stuff in that area. And like with I think they've recently renamed their center, but at the time it was a Center for Decision Research. With them, I started this, and also with some fellow classmates, started this like a group that was basically looking at the applied side of behavioral sciences, so inviting like people working at companies who are doing that stuff. Um, and so yeah, where I could, I tried to keep that piece alive.
And you kind of have a history of this, right? From, whether it was MBDS and bringing people in from the outside, or Booth and bringing people in from the outside. But, you know, you've always had sort of a outsiders have something to say to us version of behavioral science. Where do you think that comes from for you?
That's a good question. So maybe would you mind elaborating on a little bit?
Well,
Like,
so I
yeah.
think you throughout your career, you've done a good job of pulling in people from the outside,
Hmm.
right? You're in this academic setting, but you're pulling people from applied industry, other people in to sort of be involved with nominally the program around you, but also just yourself, right?
Yeah.
We invite speakers because we selfishly want to talk to that speaker, right?
Yeah.
Where do you think, I mean, is that something you saw modeled at Harvard? Like, where does that sort of like outside
Hmm.
in piece come for you?
Yeah, I think I first saw that while working with actually while working with Christina. And so her group was this really like very international group of researchers, and she was already getting involved in all of these different things, and like both hosted large speaker series with people who are not academics. She also like was starting out these new opportunities and like reaching out to people who are in business. And so I kind of saw both how interesting that could be, but also how rewarding that could be, how much stuff can kind of come out of these unexpected, atypical pairings. And so I both was, yeah, to your point, like personally interested in meeting these people who are doing these things, but also I think once you have those connections, once you have that foundation, you can find out opportunities that you would never have even thought of until actually going through it.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit like your exit from your PhD. You talk to somebody and they're like, "Oh, I have a project. Maybe you could come work with
Yeah.
me on that project," right? Uh, yeah, 100%. Okay, so you're in grad school. You go do your sort of traditional, summer consultancy at BCG. Were you like, yes, immediately, this is the right thing? Like, how did the summer consultancy sort of resonate with you?
Yeah, I think so. Those summer consultancies are basically a way for both the companies and also the people working there to get a taste of what it's like and get a sense of what the people working there are like. Um, and I think I was initially very intimidated because I just hadn't worked in this space before. But I think very quickly I both learned a tremendous amount. Like I think I learned more there than I had in any of my educational experiences before that. Um, and I end up realizing, hey, I actually like this work. Yeah, you're not like testing an idea, but there's still interesting intellectual challenges you're constantly solving. And so I think that plus you're working with interesting people, plus like it was all very different. You get to like get exposed to these very diverse challenges. I think that way, when bringing back kind of the need for cognition, that was very satisfying from a need for cognition standpoint. Um, and so I think I was like, I didn't know how much I would like it, and I ended up being kind of pleasantly surprised there.
Talk to me a little bit about intimidation because I think that's an interesting point that I want to push in on a little bit.
Yeah.
You show up on your first day in this environment of people who, it is a little bit of a different, we don't tend to wear suits in academia, right? It's a very different vibe. Talk to me a little bit about how you worked past that, found common ground, sort of, because that can be paralyzing for people. You didn't get paralyzed. What do you think worked in your favor there?
I think both there are a few things. One, it was just doing the work and actually seeing whether or not I could do the work. Two, it was one thing that was unique here, which I think it might be a shortcoming in more traditional academic spaces, is that there was tremendous amount of feedback. And so I had not really gotten that much feedback before. Much of my understanding of how I was doing before was self-reflective. Um, and that it was very explicit and very frequent once I got to BCG. And so I think that kind of there a lot of what was uncertainty in my mind of like, oh, how am I doing? How well are other people doing? I don't have this background. I haven't done this work before. Um, that was made clear and like, oh, these are the things I need to work on, but these other things are fine. And so that offered that like that kind of clarity ended up being very relieving in a way. Plus there were also plenty of supportive people who, we all exchanged ideas with each other.
Yeah, of course. Well, and there are other summer interns and, but I
Yeah.
think that feedback point is a lovely one. The academic tradition sort of encourages you to wallow a bit. Uh, Business does not. There's not a lot of,
Yeah.
it's we're going to tell you how you're doing, and
Yeah. It's
here's
in
the
their best
numbers.
interest to tell you what you need to work on
Yeah,
or
you
not.
have a rubric. Off you go. Would you Were you pretty clear, like, hey, if I could get an offer from BGG as soon as I finish up this program, I want to come here?
I realized once I had actually done a bit of the work, yes, I came to that conclusion. It's like, oh yeah, this is something I like. I think I can do. Um, why don't I try it out as a full-time job?
And so you finish up your MBA, you go off to BCG. How is BCG seeing you in this moment as you enter, right? Are they like, hey, we're making a behavioral science hire, or nah, this is another standard MBA sort of smart kid that we have?
Yeah. So I was actually expecting to be put on more work that required behavioral science, and they had been getting involved in more behavioral science stuff. Like BCG started a behavioral science lab, for example.
Yep.
But I was actually encouraged to try out other stuff. It's like if I need to get this foundation of key skills and be able to work across a variety of industries and with a variety of clients, um, I, in a way, might be doing myself a disservice by only focusing on things where there's a very obvious application of behavioral science. Like, yeah, I'll be able to do that piece well, but you need to get exposed to these newer things in order to learn them. And so, like off and on in the beginning, there were some work that involved, whether it be like change management or culture and things like that, that involved these behavioral science topics. But I also worked in other areas too, and I ended up like having to do totally new stuff on purpose, which I think was the right choice.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, there's a way to apply behavioral science in everything that's not always as obvious,
Yeah,
right? It's not sort of the like,
definitely.
and now I call it behavior,
Yeah.
we talk
Now
about.
we're doing an experiment.
That's right. Well, or now we're doing behavioral science, big B,
Yeah.
big P, or big S, right? We don't even have to say the word psychology necessarily to be doing little p psychology all of the time. Um, I often talk, people will sign up for office hours and talk about sort of career paths. And I often say, there is a very explicit version of this. You get hired for something that has behavioral science in the name and you do that. And there's another version where you just take a job and you use behavioral science to be very successful. And then at some point, a senior leader turns to you and says, Peter, how have you been so successful? And you say,
Yeah.
surprise, it was behavioral science the whole time, right?
Yeah.
And that can lead places. As you've been at BCG now for 3.5 years. Four if you count your internship, right? You spent some real serious time there.
Mhm.
Do they still see it in that sort of, you know, hey, Peter's good at this, and by the way, it might be behavioral science and it might be not, right? Or are you more forward-footed about, talking about behavioral science from the get-go and sort of applying that as a like, hey, just so you're clear, this is the thing that I'm going to do.
Yeah. Great question. So I think as you progress through a consulting career, at least at a place like BCG, you typically tend to specialize a little bit more. You tend to do more of once you get that foundational experience, you tend to do more work in the same space, whether it be an industry or a function. And I found that as I was trying out new things, a little bit differently than before, I ended up liking the stuff that did have that kind of nugget of either behavioral science or some kind of. I also did a lot of like social impact type work, that as well. Um, So I made the choice to specialize in pieces of consulting work that enabled me to more explicitly bring in some of that behavioral toolkit into work. And so that, are topics like change management, transformations. I mentioned culture before. Um, and then some also like some organizational type work. And so that's where kind of the direction I'm heading is like still like being able to both leverage and explicitly bring in those credentials and blending them with a more traditional consulting toolkit.
And why do you think, of the specializations? I mean, there are different specializations that people
Yeah.
choose down as they get more senior. It's an inevitable part of seniority. Why do you think this sort of people and change part has been the thing that has, as opposed to like product development or other kinds of versions of things, which is not to say you don't do that work, but as you become more specialized, why do you think that has risen for you?
That's a good question. I think there part of it was happenstance. There were more opportunities to do that kind of work. And I think it also, and that lends itself to further opportunities. It also blends well with the kind of work I had done before. So I had focused on, large scale behavior change type stuff. And that fits especially well in the context of something like a company transformation, where you need to get a lot of large swaths of people and departments to work together in different ways and think about things in different ways versus maybe consumer behavior, which is a little bit, might look at it from a more individualistic standpoint, which or marketing or something like that. And so that was a like some degree of self-selection and then also reinforcement as I got exposed to these opportunities.
And to your point, some of those levers are the same too, right? And
Sure.
a company like a country has rules, and you can manipulate those rules, and you can
Yeah.
set those rules, and as policies and guide, like you can, with consumers, I can't, you're very, very far. I often talk to, I do a ton of teaching in MBA programs because it's a place that
Hmm.
I sort of focus on wanting more behavioral science to be present. And one of the points I sort of try and help them understand is just how far removed from a consumer drinking a can of Coke actually is, right? Like there are bottlers and distributors and
Yeah.
distributor to distributor to distributor to distributor to distributor down to the bodega, right? Like that bodega probably didn't even buy it from you, Costco, from you, the company. They bought it from Costco Business Center,
Yeah.
right? So there's so little control as opposed to like inside of a company where you have so much more opportunity to set those constraints.
And I think that's a great point. I think that was almost part of the appeal of doing this work, not only compared to something like consumer behavior, but also compared to like the work I was doing before. You have so much control within a company to if you know what levers you need to pull, you will be able to pull them with the right buy-in and design and things like that.
Yes. Where, on the flip side, to your point, in a country, you might be
Yeah.
like, that's the right lever, but there's no
Yeah.
pathway between me and that lever.
There's 10 million other things going on.
Yeah, there's a million other things that are important. There's also legislative pieces that might,
Yeah, political considerations.
yeah, I mean, be barred from that lever for all sorts of different reasons, right? Because it's not how the country is organized. But yeah, I absolutely can hear that there's a double-sided sword. As you think about what comes next for you, not next in the terms of like, beyond BCG, but next in terms of like how you develop and sharpen some of the tools that you're doing. Do you want to keep heading down this sort of people path? Are there forks in the road that are interesting to you that you're sort of you know I don't want to say AI, but like there
Yeah.
there are other things that one can
Yeah.
think about these days. Are there things that like flip flop around for you in there?
I think where I'm at right now, I'm loving this blend of we have some degree of behavioral science in there, and I can draw on those past experiences and training. But then there's also a new piece to the puzzle. And so AI could be actually a really interesting one where there's all these like adoption challenges you need to get in order for a company to use them. It could also be continuing to work with, company transformations, which have lots of different angles to consider. So I think if I'm able to continue to keep some chunk of this training and exposure while continuing to work with some new problems, that would be nice. And I think for now there are opportunities, yes in AI to answer your question, but also in some of these other spaces, just with new problems that I haven't encountered.
Yeah, 100%. So what I'm hearing from you is sort of what interests you these days is the behavioral science right?
Yes,
There's
yes,
it's behavioral science. You want behavioral science to be in there, but you also want something else. because there are roles that are sort of pure behavioral science, right? There's much less and it is very much closer to to behavioral science. Let's talk about people,
Mhm.
right? Because so many folks come on here and they talk about the challenges of being essentially a solo behavioral scientist. Have you found a crowd at BCG? Have you grown a crowd at BCG? Like, how have you grown your community or created a community that sort of gives you that community of practice?
I think I was very pleasantly surprised to find there was actually a pretty rich community of people who are interested or actively involved in doing behavioral science work within BCG. And this might be, an overgeneralization, but I found that people who are interested in people, who people are interested in how people work, tend to be, nice people to work with, at least on the pieces that I've been exposed to so far. Um, and that has at least has been true here. So it kind of there are some subnodes of people who might be doing work on again like the marketing piece or something like that versus the large people change type work. Um, but both from a specialized knowledge standpoint and the more traditional consulting side, there is a good community there that I have been intentional in trying to be stay involved with.
Yeah, and again, you also have a lot going on. You're a new parent, right? You've got a lot going on in your personal life. Does behavioral science show up for you in in your outside of work life as well?
Um, Sometimes, yes. I would say more the traditional consulting side does. So, like one thing in unexpected ways too, like where I choose to live, for example. I remember when I was back in that earlier research side of things, there were some studies to show that the closer you live to work has a tremendous impact on your happiness. Like I think like divorce rates were more than twice as high if you live more than an hour away from work. I don't know if that's actually still holds true. And so I've like chosen to live close to both public transit and close to work. Um, when I like sit down for conversations, for example, there were studies to show that if you sit at an angle from each other versus across from each other, that conversation flows more naturally. And so there are ways like that where I think, again, it's unexpected, but it does show up. And just having that core knowledge um, continues to integrate itself. If it integrates itself, it's like I'm not pulling on it. It's just showing up in my life and on its own.
Yeah. One of the things that we see across having seen so many people on the show at this point, there are some themes you can sort of extract that there is that need for cognition, love that all behavioral scientists sort of have. We all are a little bit of puzzle solvers. There's probably an above average number of people who do puzzles and play board games and
Yeah.
systemic thinking kind of stuff. Creativity is something we hear a lot of, music, those sorts of things. What do you think about yourself as a person brought you to behavioral science and has made you successful there? When you reflect not on necessarily your skills and intelligence, but rather just like, who you are as you, what do you think
Hmm.
makes you a good behavioral scientist?
I mean, I think you for there's some external things obviously, so set those aside, like timing, getting into it, involved in the right moment.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think one, the need for cognition, that's real. I do think that's part of it. Um, I think for me, I have always been motivated by understanding and wanting to have some hand in like how people are like getting along. So like making sure that like there's good group dynamics. And so that lends itself relatively well to thinking about it from a more formal standpoint versus just getting involved. Um, like my mind is going to the big five framework if you think about like agreeableness as one of them. Um, And then I think just so it's almost as if like I also find I also have found that I'm very like curious about these new ideas, and there's a lot of ways to kind of satisfy my curiosity in this space too.
Yeah. I, if you look at your journey, there's a lot of curious elements, right? I just want to see what's over here. And
Mhm.
I want to try on an MBA. I want to see what it's like out here. That I want to see part comes across, I think, really clearly in your journey. And I think is inspirational to folks who, I think it can be tempting sometimes when you hear the word science to think of these very linear
Yeah.
bound sort of versions of things. And, rather like primatologists, there's a little bit of there's adventure science, right? Sometimes there's an adventure science where it's just I'm curious
Yeah.
about what's out there and I want to sort of wonk a little bit to find it.
And you raise a good point. I think there's when you say scientist, you think someone who's running a lab, which is what I thought initially. But it's also a tool. It's a way of solving problems. Like you can actually do experiments in the workplace. You can test things before you roll it out at scale. And it's also a knowledge base, just the way that like if you have this deep knowledge base of law, that can show up in a lot of ways in work. This can too, in just maybe slightly more unexpected ways um, than some other pools of specialized knowledge.
Yeah, and what a great way to end the episode, right? Peter McNally expecting the unexpected, right? Like that. I mean, I think that has been a highlight of your career has been that sort of,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
I'm willing to tolerate some ambiguity and maybe even attracted by that ambiguity to start to get a sense of what's there. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank
You
you
and
for
I
inviting
have,
me.
you know, uh, about 10 years apart, you and I have had a lot of similar experiences, right? We went to the same sort of college sets. We went through this like, ooh, I'm going to do a PhD, but then there's a bend in the PhD curve, and I decide I want to go a different direction. Um, I was the head of behavioral science at Frog, right, which was owned by Capgemini, so have been in this
Hmm.
sort of larger consulting realm. And so in some ways, I'll be interested to see what the next 10 year we need to meet. We need to do a
Yes.
revised episode 10 years from now when you're roughly my age, right? And we'll see,
Another look back.
where did the bends take you, right? Did you end up somewhere similar to me or did you end up somewhere different and what can we learn from that? But for now, we'll have to end it here. We cannot fast forward 10 years forward yet. We'll have to wait. Peter, thanks so much for joining me and sharing your story. And I think every story really does add to our understanding what it means to come to a place of applied behavioral science. So thank you for sharing with us.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And I'll be looking forward to 10 years from now when we'll continue the conversation.
Part two.
Yeah.